Jim Cullen, I want to ask you a two-pronged question. One is why you call your publication the Progressive Populist, and the second is because you're, as the editor of that magazine, you're better positioned than just about anybody to talk about what's actually going on out there. What signs are you seeing of populist movements, of populist activity around the country? What gives you hope for the living spirit of populism going forward?
Well, the reason we called it the Progressive Populist is because when we started the paper in 1995, there was still kind of the legacy or the reputation of populism as being a right-wing movement. People tended to identify populism with people like George Wallace or even back to Father Coughlin back in the 40s. And which we thought fundamentally missed the whole concept of populism, as Senator Harris was talking about earlier, that populists wanted to build up a government that could protect the people against corporations. That was the original concept, that you need a strong government to stand up to corporations, and that certainly is more pronounced nowadays than even it was back then in the 19th century. So we called it the Progressive Populist because when I called people up to say that we were starting the paper, they say populist. That's kind of, I don't know about that. So, and Jim Hightower had pretty much worked the brand a little bit, so we thought it was a good description of what we were up to. And I come originally from Iowa, where there is a strong latent sense of populism even after all these years. And when I grew up in the 60s, Harold Hughes had kind of revived the Democratic Party in Iowa. Until then, I think it was pretty much a straight Republican congressional delegation. And he was a former Republican and a recovering alcoholic who, and he's a recovering Republican, as it turned out. But he mounted a very much populist campaign, and I don't think he called himself a populist at that time. I don't think many people did call themselves populist because the name had been pretty much trashed during the 50s and 60s. But he was elected governor for, I think, 2 or 3 terms, and then was elected senator. And from that, then Iowa started electing Democratic congressmen, and we still have Tom Harkin, who I think kind of is in the same mold as Hughes to some extent. And we also see the same thing in Minnesota, where you had Hubert Humphrey. I guess you'd call him a New Deal liberal, but there is still, I think, a strong sense of populism, particularly in the Democratic Farm Labor Party of Minnesota, and the Dakotas were very strong populism. Nebraska, it's hard to believe, Nebraska and Oklahoma for that matter, that they were such strong populist states, and now they produce such reactionary, conservative politicians. But there is still, I think, a strong sense of populism under the skin, and people like Charles Grassley in Iowa. He appeals to a populist nature, and Dick Armey, I think, has made a conscious effort to strike these populist themes in organizing the Tea Party. He's originally from North Dakota, which practically had a socialist government back in the early 20th century. And I think he's adapted a lot of the populist rhetoric to protect corporations and health insurance companies. It's a particular genius to turn the populist movement to look after the interests of health insurance corporations. But we we started the Populist to at least give people a voice and try to develop a counterattack against the corporateocracy.
All right, Senator Harris, you're one of the few people who's run for president as a genuine populist back in 1976 with Mr. Hightower at your side. And I wanted to hear some stories about what it was like to run as a populist for the Democratic nomination, but also based on your experiences and your observations, whether you can imagine a real populist making a successful run for president in the future. What would that take?
One year I was teaching in London, one semester, and about midway through this course, I thought by then everybody knew about my background. I said, to illustrate something, I said, when I ran for president, and this young woman in the front row, she always jumped out of her chair, and she was from Iowa, actually, too. She said, "You ran for president?" And I said, yes, I did. And she said, "President of what?" I said, "President of the United States." She said, "President of the United States?" I said, "Yes, and I should tell you that I was not elected." She wrote that down. This may be on the exam. He was not elected. Jim mentioned Harold Hughes, great senator. I served with him from Iowa. For some reason, we found when I was running for president that people confused the two of us. I think it's our craggy good looks or something. And we began to hear from out in the country, Jim and I and others, saying, "Well, you know, this guy's an alcoholic or was an alcoholic. How can he be running for president?" And so we finally figured they got me mixed up with Harold Hughes. So we had to put in our literature something that, you know, we are not, this is not Harold Hughes. Jim, one time Jim was introducing me to a group outside in a rally in Lincoln, Nebraska. And most of the people were family farmers that he and others of us had been involved with. Right on the front row, very solemn kind of group. And these are guys, you know, with the top half of their forehead white, where their hats have come while they're driving around on a tractor. And Jim was getting ready to introduce me, and he said, "Ours is a campaign of issues." He says, "Our candidate is not just another pretty face, as you can plainly see." And here's these old guys are sitting there, and they're thinking, "Yeah, he's right about that." Jim turned around to me and said, I think we've stumbled into a Lord Benson meeting." After twice being elected to the Senate from Oklahoma, I did not run again in order to get ready to run for president. I spent considerable time working on populist kind of issues. I mentioned Ralph Nader a while ago. Ralph and I, there had been an ad. Well, it was run as a public service ad, I think, on the networks, on network television. Wally Schirra. It starts out with you're out in outer space and you see the Earth as a great blue marble, and it gets closer and closer, and finally it gets down to, you see Wally Schirra, former astronaut. He's walking along some abandoned railroad tracks, and grass is growing up in the tracks. And then Wally Schirra looks into the camera and he says, "America's railroads are in trouble." And then he goes on to say, it turns out this is a railroad ad, saying what they need is some federal subsidies. Railroads do. So Ralph and I made an ad just like that. Same thing, we're outer space, down to Earth, closer and closer. And then here I am walking down these abandoned railroad tracks.